By the year 1896, the patience of the Filipino people had reached its limit. Centuries of colonial rule, injustice, and unfulfilled promises had forged not submission, but strength. From the darkness of oppression emerged a light, the burning desire for freedom. What began as secret whispers in the night would soon become a cry heard around the world. For more than 300 years, Spain had ruled the Philippines with the combined powers of the cross and the sword. It had built cities, churches, and schools, but also prisons, gallows, and chains. The people had learned to read, to pray, and to obey. But they had also learned to think, to question, and to dream. The age of passive loyalty was over. The spark of revolution was ignited by a secret society, the Kagalang-galangang Katipunan Anga. Anak nanga, bayanon simply, the Katipunan. Founded in Iba by Andres Bonifacio, Emilio Jacinto, Ladislao Diwa, and a few brave companions. It was born out of the ashes of La Liga Filipina, the reform movement, crushed by the Spanish authorities. The Katipunan was different. It no longer asked for reform. It demanded independence. Its members were bound by oath and brotherhood. They wrote their pledges in their own blood, swearing to fight until their country was free. Bonifacio, a warehouse clerk with little formal education, but immense conviction, became the society's leader. Supremo ng Katipunan. He believed that freedom was not granted by the oppressor, but seized by the oppressed. The organization spread rapidly through the towns of Luzon and the Visayas. Its members came from every walk of life: workers, farmers, teachers, and even some members of the prince. The Katipunan's message was simple yet powerful: Kalayan and Bayan, freedom of the people. They printed their own newspaper, Kalayan, written by Emilio Jacinto, the brains of the Katipunan. Through coded letters, secret meetings, and whispered vows, the seeds of rebellion grew in silence. But in August 1896, betrayal shattered their secrecy. A Spanish friar, informed by a Filipino spy, uncovered the existence of the Katipunan. The authorities raided homes and arrested suspected members. Realizing that discovery meant death, Bonifacio and his men decided that the time for hiding was over. The time for revolution had come. On August 23, 1896, in the town of Caloocan, the Katipuneros gathered there. Bonifacio led his men in a symbolic act of defiance. They tore their Segulas residence certificates that symbolized Spanish subjugation, and shouted with one voice, "Mabuhay ang Kalayan ng Pilipinas." It was the cry of Pujadlawin, the birth of the Philippine Revolution. The revolution spread quickly across the provinces. In San Juan del Monte, Katipuneros launched their first attack on a Spanish garrison. Though they were poorly armed and often defeated in battle, their courage inspired others. Town after town joined the uprising. What had begun as a secret brotherhood became a national war. Bonifacio led the movement with passion and determination, but soon divisions began to appear among the revolutionaries. In the province of Cavite, a young general named Emilio Aguinaldo emerged as a capable military leader. His forces achieved significant victories against the Spanish troops, earning him fame and the loyalty of many revolutionaries. Tensions grew between Bonifacio's central leadership and Aguinaldo's regional power. Differences in vision, strategy, and pride threatened to tear the movement apart. In March 1897, at the Tijeros Convention, the revolutionary leaders met to establish a new government. Aguinaldo was elected president. Bonifacio, feeling humiliated and betrayed, refused to recognize the result. Civil conflict erupted within the revolution itself. Shortly after, Bonifacio was arrested by Aguinaldo's men, tried for sedition, and executed in May 1897. His death marked one of the most painful moments in the struggle for independence, a tragedy that revealed both the strength and fragility of the Filipino Revolution. Despite the internal divisions, the revolution pressed on. The new revolutionary government, based in Biak-na-Bato, sought to consolidate the fight. Aguinaldo and his generals established a constitution and continued resistance against the Spanish forces. But by late 1897, both sides were exhausted. The Spanish government, desperate to end the conflict, offered peace and reform in exchange for Aguinaldo's exile. On December 14, 1897, the Pact of Biak-na-Bato was signed. Aguinaldo agreed to go into exile in Hong Kong, taking with him funds promised by the Spaniards. In return, Spain pledged to implement political reforms and grant amnesty to the rebels. But those promises would never be fulfilled. The revolution had paused, but it was far from over. As Aguinaldo waited in exile, Events beyond the Philippines would soon change the course of history. In April 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. The United States, seeking to challenge Spain's empire, declared war after the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The conflict that began in Cuba would soon reach the Pacific. On May 1, 1898, the American Asiatic Squadron, under Commodore George Dewey, entered Manila Bay. In a swift and decisive battle, the Spanish fleet was destroyed. Spain's centuries-long control of the Philippines began to crumble. From Hong Kong, Aguinaldo saw an opportunity. He returned to the Philippines with American support, confident that the enemy of Spain could be the ally of Filipino freedom. On June 12, 1898, in the town of Coet, Cavite, Aguinaldo proclaimed the independence of the Philippines. The flag of the new nation was raised, and the national anthem was played for the first time. It was a moment of triumph, a dream finally realized after centuries of struggle. The declaration proclaimed that the Philippines was free, independent under the protection of the Almighty God. Across the islands, bells rang. People cheered, and the hope of a new beginning filled the air. But while Filipinos celebrated their freedom, another destiny was being written elsewhere. In December of that same year, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War. In that treaty, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million, without a single Filipino representative at the table. Once again, the fate of the Philippines was decided by foreign powers. The revolution that had won independence now faced a new conqueror. The final days of Spanish rule were bittersweet. Spain's empire, once vast and powerful, had collapsed under the weight of history. For the Filipinos, victory was near, but freedom remained incomplete. Yet the revolution had already achieved something greater than political independence. It had awakened a nation. It had transformed the people's identity from subjects into citizens, from followers into fighters. For the first time, the idea of Filipino meant more than geography. It meant belonging to a nation united by sacrifice, courage, and hope. The revolution proved that the Filipino was capable of leadership, of bravery, and of vision. It shattered the myth that only foreign powers could govern. It showed the world that the people of these islands, once called Indios, were capable of shaping their own destiny. Though the revolution did not end with the peace it sought, its spirit endured. It lived on in the hearts of the next generation, those who would fight again, not against Spain, but against a new empire. The war for freedom would continue, but it would no longer be fought for reform or recognition. It would be fought for sovereignty, for the right to stand equal among nations. The Philippine Revolution of 1896 to 1898 was more than a war of independence. It was a moral awakening, a rebirth of national identity. It united the educated and the poor, the priest and the peasant, the Christian and the Muslim, under one flag and one vision, a free and united Philippines. From the mountains of Cavite to the fields of Bulacan, from the prisons of Manila to the exile of Hong Kong, the revolution lived on in the faith of a people who refused to surrender. Its heroes, Bonifacio, Jacinto, Aguinaldo, Rizal, and countless unnamed others, gave their lives so that generations to come could live with dignity and pride. And though the flag that was raised in 1898 would fall again under another empire, its colors, red, blue, white, and yellow, would continue to wave in the hearts of millions. The revolution had begun in secrecy, grown in defiance, and ended in betrayal. But its legacy endured, not as a failure, but as a foundation. It was proof that freedom, once imagined, could never again be erased. As the sun set on Spanish rule, a new dawn was rising over the archipelago. The chains of empire had broken, but new challenges awaited. The Filipino had learned to fight, and now, he would have to learn to stand. The revolution of 1896 to 1898 was the soul of a nation being born in fire. A people discovering their strength, their unity, and their destiny. And from that fire, out of blood and tears, the Philippines emerged. Not yet free, but forever awakened. When the sun rose over the Philippines on June 12, 1898, it illuminated a new flag and a new dream. For the first time in over 3 centuries, the Filipino people stood as masters of their own land. The revolution that began in secret meetings and blood oaths had blossomed into the birth of a nation. Yet, even as freedom's light filled the sky, a shadow lingered on the horizon, one that would soon darken the promise of independence. The victory over Spain had not come solely from the strength of Filipino arms. Across the Pacific, another power had intervened, a young nation, born itself from revolution, proclaiming liberty and democracy as its ideals, the United States of America. To the Filipinos, the Americans first appeared as allies, even liberators. To the Americans, the Philippines was a strategic prize, the gateway to Asia, rich in potential, and positioned at the crossroads of empire. When Commodore George Dewey's fleet destroyed the Spanish Armada in Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, Spain's centuries-long dominion crumbled overnight. The Filipinos rejoiced. Emilio Aguinaldo, returning from exile with American assistance, resumed command of the revolutionary forces. Together, Filipino and American troops surrounded Manila. Spain's rule was finished, or so it seemed. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo proclaimed Philippine independence in Kuwait. The flag designed by the revolutionaries was raised, and the national anthem, Lupang Hinirang, was played for the first time. It was a moment of triumph, born from sacrifice and unity. The new government began to take shape, drafting a constitution and establishing the first Philippine Republic in Malolos, Bulacan. For a brief and shining moment, the Philippines stood as Asia's first democratic republic. But the world beyond the islands had other plans. In December 1898, while the revolutionaries celebrated their independence, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. With the stroke of a pen, Spain ceded the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States for $20 million. No Filipino representative was invited to the negotiations. The fate of the nation had once again been decided by foreign powers, without its consent. When the treaty was ratified, the United States declared sovereignty over the Philippines. The revolutionaries, who had fought for liberty from Spain, now found themselves under a new colonizer. Disbelief turned to outrage, and outrage to defiance. The revolution, it seemed, was not yet over. It had merely changed its enemy. At first, there was hope for diplomacy. Aguinaldo sought recognition from the Americans, appealing to their ideals of freedom and justice. He wrote letters, sent envoys, and reminded them that the Filipino people had fought beside them against Spain. But Washington had already made its decision. President William McKinley, influenced by expansionist sentiment and the belief in America's manifest destiny, declared that the United States had a moral duty to civilize and educate the Filipino people. To the Americans, the Philippines was not a partner, it was a possession. Tensions escalated quickly. American troops occupied Manila, refusing to allow Filipino forces to enter the city. Mistrust deepened on both sides. The revolutionaries surrounded the capital, while the Americans fortified their positions. The uneasy truce collapsed on February 4, 1899, when a skirmish broke out between an American patrol and Filipino soldiers in the district of San Juan. The shots that rang out that night marked the beginning of the Philippine-American War. The conflict that followed was brutal and heartbreaking. What had begun as a war of independence turned into a struggle for survival. The American army, far superior in weapons and resources, advanced through Luzon, capturing towns and dispersing resistance. The Filipino forces, poorly equipped but determined, fought a guerrilla war, melting into the forests and mountains, striking where least expected, refusing to surrender. In Malolos, Aguinaldo's government was forced to retreat. The capital fell, and the republic became a government on the run. Yet even in exile, the dream of freedom endured. Filipino generals like Antonio Luna, Gregorio del Pilar, and Macario Saque continued the fight with courage and skill. Luna, a brilliant strategist, sought to unify the revolutionary army under discipline and modern tactics. But divisions, jealousy, and betrayal weakened the resistance. Luna was assassinated in 1899, a devastating blow to the cause. One by one, the strongholds of the revolution fell. The young General Gregorio del Pilar made his last stand at the Battle of Tirad Pass in December 1899, delaying American forces to allow Aguinaldo to escape. He died at 24. His bravery immortalized in history as the boy general. His sacrifice symbolized the tragic beauty of the Filipino struggle, valiant, pure, and doomed. By early 1901, Aguinaldo had been captured in Palanan, Isabela, by American forces using deception and native scouts. Under heavy pressure, he swore allegiance to the United States and called for an end to resistance. The organized phase of the revolution was over. The first Philippine Republic, the first of its kind in Asia, had fallen. But even then, the war did not end. Across the islands, guerrilla fighters continued to resist, led by figures such as Macario Saque, Miguel Malvar, and others. They fought not for territory, but for dignity, for the right to exist as a free people. The Americans responded with harsh measures, scorched earth campaigns, concentration zones, and mass arrests. Entire villages were burned. Tens of thousands of Filipinos, both soldiers and civilians, perished from violence, hunger, and disease. The United States officially declared the war over in 1902, but the peace that followed was uneasy. The Philippines had exchanged one empire for another, yet even in defeat, something irreversible had happened. The Filipino spirit, once bound by colonial rule, had awakened and could not be subdued. Under American rule, new systems of governance, education, and infrastructure were introduced. English replaced Spanish as the language of instruction. Roads, bridges, and schools were built, and elections were held under limited suffrage. The United States called its policy benevolent assimilation, the idea that America had come not as a conqueror but as a teacher. To many Filipinos, these reforms were both a blessing and a burden. They brought progress and opportunity, but also erased parts of their history and identity. The American education system sought to create loyal subjects, just as the Spanish missionaries once had. But history would repeat itself. The same schools that taught obedience would soon produce thinkers and leaders who demanded independence. The transition from revolution to colonization was a time of both loss and rebirth. The old colonial world of friars and encomenderos was gone, replaced by a modern, bureaucratic empire. The Philippine flag, once proudly raised in Kuwait, was lowered. Yet, in classrooms, churches, and hidden communities, the story of the revolution lived on, whispered by elders, written by poets, remembered by every heart that still believed in Caleb. The revolution had failed to secure political freedom, but it had succeeded in something greater. It had forged a national soul. It taught Filipinos who they were and what they could become. It proved that they could stand against empire, that their courage could match any army, and that their love for their homeland was stronger than fear. As the 20th century began, the Philippines found itself at a crossroads between past and future, between colonialism and independence, submission and self-rule. The generation that had fought under Bonifacio and Aguinaldo passed the torch to a new one. Leaders like Manuel Roxas, Sergio Osmega, and Claro M. Recto, who would continue the struggle in new forms. The revolution of 1896 had ended, but the revolution of the Filipino spirit continued. The people who had once been called Indios were now Filipinos, heirs to a history written in blood and belief. And though the American flag now flew over Manila, the wind beneath it carried another banner, unseen but unbroken. The flag of a nation still dreaming, still striving, still alive. The years between 1898 and 1902 were not the end of the Philippine Revolution. They were its transformation, the passage from war to awakening, from despair to endurance. The dream of freedom had survived the fall of Spain, the betrayal of treaties, and the fire of new empire. Empires come and go, but the idea of a nation endures. The revolution had not been defeated, it had been reborn. And in the quiet hearts of its people, the struggle for true independence continued, waiting for the day when the flag of the Philippines would rise again, not as a symbol of hope, but as the truth of freedom itself. When the guns of the revolution finally fell silent in 1902, the Philippines stood at the threshold of a new era. The old empire of Spain was gone, but another had taken its place. The United States of America, a nation that spoke of liberty and democracy, now held the islands in its grasp. What began as conquest soon turned into a vast social experiment, the attempt to build a modern colony in the image of the West. The Americans called their policy benevolent assimilation. It was a phrase meant to soften the reality of empire to convince both Filipinos and the world that this new rule was different from the old. The United States, they claimed, had not come to exploit, but to uplift, not to enslave, but to educate. President William McKinley, in his proclamation of 1898, declared that America's mission was to win the confidence, respect, and affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines. To many Filipinos, these words rang hollow. After years of war and loss, the people were weary but not conquered. Yet the Americans approached colonization with a different method, not through faith and fear, as the Spaniards had done, but through schools, elections, and the promise of progress. They would not rule with the whip, but with the blackboard. The first great change came through education. In 1901, the U.S. government sent hundreds of American teachers, known as the Tamasites, to the Philippines aboard the ship Thomas. They were young men and women from across America, carrying textbooks instead of weapons. Their mission was to teach English, science, and democratic values to a nation still reeling from war. Schools were built in every province. English became the medium of instruction, replacing Spanish and gradually spreading across the islands. For the first time, education was made accessible to a wider population, not just the elite. Children who had grown up in remote towns now sat in classrooms, learning to read, write, and count in a foreign tongue. This new education system transformed the Philippines. It created a generation of literate, ambitious Filipinos who would later become the leaders of their country. But it also reshaped the nation's identity. English brought opportunities, but it also created distance between the educated and the poor, between the colonial rulers and the native languages that carried centuries of tradition. The Americans understood the power of education as both a gift and a tool of control. By teaching loyalty to the flag and the virtues of democracy, they sought to mold the Filipino mind. Yet, like the Spanish before them, they could not control how knowledge would be used. The same schools that taught obedience also taught self-respect and critical thought. Once again, education planted the seeds of independence. While the classroom reshaped minds, the Americans also restructured government. In 1901, the Philippine Commission, headed by William Howard Taft, became the highest legislative authority. Taft, who would later become President of the United States, famously described the Filipinos as our little brown brothers, reflecting both paternal affection and colonial arrogance. Taft administration sought to introduce American-style governance. Provincial governments were organized, local officials were elected, and courts were established. Roads, bridges, and hospitals were built across the islands. For the first time, the colony saw large-scale public works projects that connected distant provinces and modernized Manila into a bustling colonial capital. Yet the heart of American policy lay in gradualism. The United States promised eventual independence, but not yet. They would, they said, prepare the Filipinos for self-government. What this meant in practice was decades of tutelage, where Filipinos could participate in government, but never fully ruled themselves. In 1907, the first Philippine Assembly was convened, the first elected legislative body under American rule. It gave Filipinos a voice, but not complete authority. The U.S. Governor General retained the power to veto laws and control the executive branch. Still, this assembly became a training ground for democracy. Filipino leaders, many of them former revolutionaries, learned to navigate the new political landscape. Among them were men who would later become giants of the nation's future: Manuel L. Quezon, Sergio Zmiga, Claudio Emi, Recto, and Manuel Roxas. They mastered the language of politics as they once had mastered the language of arms. Through debate, diplomacy, and persistence, they turned the tools of colonization into instruments of progress. By the 1910s, a new political force emerged, the Nacionalista Party, led by Quezon and Osmega. Its goal was clear: Philippine independence. But unlike Bonificio's revolution, this struggle was fought not with rifles, but with reason. The Nacionalistas used negotiation and persuasion, appealing to American ideals of freedom and equality. In 1916, their efforts bore fruit with the passage of the Jones Law, also known as the Philippine Autonomy Act. The law promised that the United States would recognize Philippine independence once a stable government was established. It also replaced the Philippine Commission with a fully elected legislature, the Philippine Senate. For the first time, Filipinos had control over their own laws, marking a major step toward sovereignty. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Philippines grew increasingly self-governing. American governors were gradually replaced by Filipino officials. Quezon and Osmega led delegations to Washington, lobbying for complete independence. In 1934, the perseverance culminated in the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which established a 10-year transition period toward full independence under a Commonwealth government. The Commonwealth of the Philippines was inaugurated in 1935, with Manuel L. Quezon as its first president. Under the new constitution, the Philippines had its own government, flag, and national institutions, though still under American supervision. The Commonwealth period symbolized both freedom and dependence, a bridge between colony and nationhood. Quezon's administration focused on preparing the country for full independence. He established the National Defense Act, creating the Philippine Army under General Douglas MacArthur, who served as military advisor. Economic reforms were launched, public education expanded, and Filipino culture was promoted. The dream of an independent republic seemed within reach, but fate intervened. On December 8, 1941, just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck the Philippines. The islands were drawn into the flames of World War II. The Japanese invasion shattered the Commonwealth and plunged the country into 3 years of suffering and resistance. President Quezon and his government fled to the United States, where they continued to represent the Philippine nation in exile. In the homeland, Filipino guerrillas fought bravely against Japanese occupation, keeping alive the spirit of independence. The dream that had survived Spanish rule and American colonization now endured the fires of global war. When the war ended in 1945, the Philippines lay in ruins. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was reduced to ashes, its streets filled with the echoes of death and the courage of survival. Yet from that devastation arose renewal. On July 4, 1946, the United States formally recognized the independence of the Republic of the Philippines. The ceremony in Manila was both solemn and joyous. The American flag was lowered, and the Philippine flag rose in its place, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as the sign of a sovereign nation at last. After nearly 400 years of colonial rule, first under Spain, then under America, the Philippines stood free. The long road from the Revolution of 1896 to independence in 1946 had been marked by struggle, loss, and resilience. The American colonial period left a complex legacy. It brought education, democracy, and infrastructure, but also dependency, inequality, and cultural dislocation. It gave Filipinos the tools of governance, but also shaped their politics in the image of another nation. It taught liberty, even as it denied it. Yet through it all, the Filipino spirit endured. The people learned to use the systems of their colonizers to reclaim their own destiny. They mastered English but never forgot their native tongues. They absorbed democracy but infused it with their own humanity, their own warmth, their own vision. By the time the flag was raised in 1946, the Philippines was not merely inheriting freedom, it was fulfilling a destiny, centuries in the making. The revolution that began in the alleys of Tondo and the mountains of Cavite had finally achieved its purpose. The road from colonialism to nationhood was long and painful, but it forged a people of resilience and faith. The Filipinos had survived empire after empire, and in the end, they had turned the lessons of conquest into the foundations of a republic. The American period was not the end of history, it was the passage to self-awareness. It taught the Philippines how to govern, how to hope, and how to rebuild. And though independence came with its own challenges, it carried the promise that this time, the nation's destiny would no longer be decided by foreign hands, but by its own. From the ashes of war and the ruins of empire, the Philippines emerged, wounded but unbroken, humbled but proud, ready to stand as one of Asia's free nations. The long journey, from the cross to the classroom, from the revolution to the republic, had reached its end. But in truth, it was only the beginning. The dawn of the 1940s brought with it the promise of freedom. The Philippines was only a few years away from full independence under the Commonwealth government. The people were hopeful, proud of their progress, confident in their leaders, and ready to stand among the free nations of the world. But just as the dream was within reach, the world itself was consumed by war. The storm began in Europe, then swept across Asia. Japan, rising as a military power, sought to dominate the Pacific. Its armies had conquered Manchuria, invaded China, and now set their sights on Southeast Asia, rich in oil, rubber, and resources. The Philippines, strategically located between the Pacific and the South China Sea, became a critical target. On December 8, 1941, only 10 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese planes appeared over Manila. Explosions thundered across the city. Airfields, naval bases, and military camps were destroyed. The peaceful archipelago was thrust into the horrors of World War II. The United States and the Philippines fought side by side under the banner of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East USA, FFE, led by General Douglas MacArthur. Filipino and American soldiers stood together in defense of the islands. But Japan's forces were overwhelming, swift, organized, and relentless. Within weeks, the Japanese army swept through Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Manila was declared an open city to spare it from destruction. But even that could not stop the chaos. Refugees fled the capital. Families were torn apart. The young and old alike were forced to face the unthinkable. By January 1942, Japanese troops entered Manila. The city fell, and the occupation began. MacArthur withdrew to the fortress island of Corregidor, where he made his famous promise, "I shall return." Soon after, he was ordered to leave for Australia, leaving behind tens of thousands of soldiers, both Filipino and American, to continue the fight. On the Bataan Peninsula, the defenders of freedom made their stand. For months, Filipino and American troops resisted, despite starvation, disease, and dwindling ammunition. Their bravery became legendary. They fought not only against the enemy but against hunger and despair. Yet on April 9, 1942, Bataan fell. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Philippine history. The Bataan Death March. Nearly 80,000 prisoners of war, Filipino and American, were forced to march over 100 kilometers from Mariveles to San Fernando, under the blazing sun, without food or water. Thousands perished along the way from exhaustion, disease, and execution. The march became a symbol of both suffering and heroism, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. After Bataan came the fall of Corregidor in May 1942. The last stronghold of resistance collapsed, and the Philippines was completely under Japanese control. The Japanese declared the creation of the Second Philippine Republic, a puppet government led by Jose P. Laurel, under the slogan, Asia for Asians. They promised independence, but it was a hollow freedom, shadowed by occupation, fear, and bloodshed. The Japanese government imposed strict censorship, propaganda, and military law. Newspapers, radio, and schools were used to spread the ideals of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Japan's vision of an Asia free from Western influence, but ruled under its empire. In reality, the occupation brought terror. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or executed for suspicion of espionage or resistance. Women suffered horrific abuses, forced into servitude as comfort women. Food became scarce, inflation rose, and families lived in constant fear of arrest. But even in darkness, the flame of resistance burned bright. Across the islands, guerrilla movements rose from the jungles and mountains. Former soldiers, peasants, and ordinary citizens took up arms, refusing to bow to the invaders. They formed secret networks, sabotaged Japanese operations, and gathered intelligence for the returning Allied forces. In Luzon, leaders like Luis Taruk organized the Hukbalahap, the People's Army against the Japanese, a formidable guerrilla force made up largely of farmers. In the Visayas and Mindanao, other resistance groups emerged, fighting in silence and shadows. Women also played vital roles as couriers, nurses, and spies, risking their lives to save others. Despite Japan's efforts to crush dissent, the resistance only grew stronger. The guerrillas became the backbone of national survival, the hidden army of a nation refusing to die. By 1944, the tide of war had turned. Japan's empire was weakening under the weight of Allied counterattacks. True to his word, General Douglas MacArthur prepared to return. On October 20, 1944, he waded ashore at Leyte Gulf, accompanied by Filipino troops, and declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." The liberation had begun. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in late 1944, became one of the largest naval battles in history. Japanese forces were decisively defeated. The combined strength of American and Filipino troops advanced across the islands, retaking town after town. Yet liberation came at a terrible cost. The Japanese army, desperate and brutal, turned its fury on civilians. Nowhere was this more tragic than in Manila. Between February and March 1945, the Battle of Manila reduced the once beautiful capital, the Pearl of the Orient, to ruins. Street by street, house by house, the city burned. Civilians were massacred. Hospitals, churches, and schools were destroyed. By the time the battle ended, more than 100,000 civilians were dead, and Manila lay in ashes. When the smoke cleared, the war was over. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the Philippines, the people emerged from years of suffering, broken but unbowed. The occupation had tested their endurance, but it had also strengthened their unity. The war left scars that would never fully heal. More than 1 million Filipinos had died. Entire cities and towns were destroyed. But out of the wreckage came a renewed spirit, a deeper understanding of freedom, born not from speeches or treaties, but from sacrifice. In the aftermath, the United States recognized the immense heroism of the Filipino people. Reconstruction began under the Philippine Rehabilitation Act, and the long-promised independence finally drew near. On July 4, 1946, the Philippines became a free and sovereign republic. The flag that had been raised in 1898 rose once again, not as a symbol of rebellion, but of triumph. The people who had endured conquest, colonization, and war now stood tall among the nations of the world. The Japanese occupation remains one of the most painful yet defining periods in Philippine history. It revealed the extremes of human cruelty, but also the heights of Filipino courage. It reminded the world that freedom is never given. It is earned, defended, and, if necessary, died for. From the ashes of Manila to the fields of Bataan, from the jungles of Luzon to the shores of Leyte, the story of those years is one of faith and defiance, of a people who refused to surrender their soul. When historians speak of war, they speak of armies and empires. But the true heart of the Philippine story lies in its people, in the mother who hid soldiers in her home, in the farmer who carried messages through the night, in the child who prayed beneath the sound of bombs. They were not conquerors or generals. They were the nation itself, ordinary Filipinos who proved that love for one's country is stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger even than death. The years 1941 to 1945 were not just a time of war. They were the crucible of the Filipino spirit. Out of suffering came solidarity. Out of ruin came rebirth. Out of occupation came independence. And when peace finally returned, the Philippines rose, scarred, yes, but undefeated, ready to rebuild, to forgive, and to move forward into a future shaped by the lessons of its past. When the guns of World War II fell silent, the Philippines was a nation reborn from ashes. The war had ended, but its wounds were everywhere, on the ruined streets of Manila, in the empty homes of the fallen, and in the hearts of millions who had survived the unthinkable. For nearly 4 centuries, the Filipino people had been subjects, first of Spain, then of the United States, and finally under the iron hand of war. But now, at last, the time had come to stand as a free and sovereign nation. On July 4, 1946, amid celebration and tears, the Republic of the Philippines was proclaimed independent. In the same city that had seen so much suffering, the Philippine flag was raised beside the American banner. As the U.S. flag was lowered, the sun and stars of the Filipino flag rose proudly into the sky. The same flag first waved in Cavite in 1898. The long journey from revolution to independence was complete. But freedom, as the Filipinos would learn, was not the end of struggle. It was the beginning of responsibility, a nation reborn. The first president of the independent republic, Manuel Roxas, inherited a nation in ruins. Cities had been destroyed, farms burned, industries shattered. Over 1 million Filipinos had died in the war, and the economy was on the verge of collapse. To rebuild, the Philippines had to start almost from zero. The United States provided financial aid through the Philippine Rehabilitation Act of 1946, and war-damaged infrastructures were restored. But this aid came with strings attached. The Bell Trade Act, passed the same year, tied the Philippine economy to American interests. It granted U.S. citizens equal access to Philippine natural resources, and required the peso to be pegged to the U.S. dollar. Economically, the Philippines had gained independence, but remained in America's shadow. Despite these challenges, the Filipino people persevered. Roxas and his successor, Elpidio Quirino, focused on rebuilding the economy, stabilizing the government, and restoring education. The capital city of Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, rose from its ruins, a living symbol of the nation's resilience. But not all was peaceful. The post-war years saw social unrest, fueled by inequality and broken promises. The Hukbalahap movement, once heroes of the anti-Japanese resistance, turned into a peasant rebellion against the government, demanding land reform and justice. For many in the countryside, freedom had changed little. Power and land remained in the hands of a few. Democracy and division. In the 1950s, under President Ramon Magsaysay, the Philippines experienced a brief golden era of reform. Magsaysay, a man of humble origins, won the hearts of the masses. Known as the People's President, he championed the poor, strengthened rural development, and restored faith in democracy. His leadership brought a sense of hope and honesty to government, a rare moment of unity after years of hardship. But his sudden death in a plane crash in 1957 marked the end of that era. The presidents who followed, Carlos P. Garcia, Diosdado Macapagal, and later Ferdinand Marcos, each faced the same dilemma: how to balance the nation's democratic ideals with its deep social and economic inequalities. Under Ferdinand Marcos, who was elected in 1965, the Philippines entered a new and controversial chapter. Initially celebrated for his charisma and vision, Marcos promised modernization and national greatness. But as the years passed, his leadership turned from promise to power. In 1972, citing threats of communism and civil disorder, Marcos declared martial law. He suspended the constitution, dissolved Congress, and ruled by decree. Civil liberties were curtailed, opponents were arrested, and the press was silenced. The once vibrant democracy became a dictatorship. Under the banner of the new society, Marcos claimed to bring order and discipline. And for a time, progress did appear. Roads were built, industries expanded, and cultural identity was promoted. Yet beneath the surface, corruption and repression flourished. Billions were stolen from the nation's coffers, while dissenters disappeared into prisons and graves. It was a time of fear, but also of awakening. The Filipino people, who had fought so long for freedom, once again found themselves under tyranny. And once again, they resisted. Revolution without arms. By the early 1980s, the cracks in the regime were visible. The assassination of opposition leader, Benigno Nino Aquino Jr., in 1983, became the spark that reignited the people's will. His death on the airport tarmac shocked the nation and awakened a movement that could no longer be silenced. Millions took to the streets, not with weapons, but with courage. In February 1986, a peaceful uprising known as the EDSA People Power Revolution swept through Manila. Soldiers, civilians, priests, and nuns stood together in defiance, holding rosaries and flowers instead of guns. Faced with overwhelming public pressure, Ferdinand Marcos fled into exile, and the nation once again reclaimed its freedom, this time through unity and faith, not bloodshed. Corazon Aquino, the widow of the slain senator, became the first female president of the Philippines. Her rise marked the restoration of democracy and the triumph of peaceful resistance. The 1987 Constitution reinstated civil rights, limited presidential power, and ensured that the dark days of dictatorship would not easily return. The challenges of a new republic of decades that followed were marked by both progress and struggle. The Philippines had democracy, but democracy alone could not erase poverty, inequality, or corruption. Successive presidents faced the daunting task of balancing economic growth with social justice. Fidel Cincuén Ramos, a former general, brought stability and reform in the 1990s. His leadership emphasized modernization, economic liberalization, and peace talks with rebels. The nation began to regain confidence. But new challenges loomed: population growth, foreign debt, and political scandals. The dawn of the new millennium saw dramatic shifts. The presidency of Joseph Estrada, marked by populism and controversy, ended abruptly in 2001. After another mass uprising, EDSA II forced him from office. His successor, Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, presided over economic progress, but also faced allegations of corruption and political unrest. Despite the turbulence, the Philippines remained resilient. Its democratic institutions survived, even when tested by scandal and crisis. Its people continued to rise above hardship through faith, creativity, and a deep sense of community. Modern Philippines' identity and transformation in the 21st century. The Philippines entered a new stage, one shaped by globalization, migration, and technology. Millions of Filipinos left home to work abroad, becoming overseas Filipino workers (OFWs). Their remittances fueled the national economy, but their absence reshaped families and communities. The Filipino spirit, adaptable and enduring, extended across the world. Politically, the country continued its search for balance. Presidents from Benigno Aquino III to Rodrigo Duterte brought contrasting visions, one emphasizing reform and integrity, the other invoking strength and discipline. Each reflected a nation still defining what freedom truly means. Economically, the Philippines emerged as one of Southeast Asia's fastest-growing nations. Its cities expanded, its industries diversified, and its people excelled in fields from business and education to art and technology. Yet, poverty and inequality remained persistent, echoing the struggles of centuries past. Culturally, the Philippines blossomed into a vibrant tapestry of East and West, a nation where Catholic faith coexists with indigenous traditions, where English and Filipino merge into one voice, and where the memory of colonization shapes but does not define identity. The Filipino identity, born from conquest, refined by struggle, and sustained by faith, has become a symbol of endurance. In every crisis, whether war, dictatorship, or disaster, the same truth remains: the Filipino does not break. Defining the Filipino spirit from 1946 to the present, the story of the Philippines has been one of resilience. Every generation has faced its own trials, rebuilding from ruins, challenging corruption, surviving natural disasters, and striving for unity. Yet each generation has also carried the same fire that burned in the hearts of the revolutionaries of 1896. The belief that this nation, no matter how tested, will endure. The Philippines is a country of contradictions. Modern yet traditional, global yet deeply local, wounded yet hopeful. Its strength lies not in its wealth or power, but in its people, in their faith, their laughter, their compassion, and their unbreakable will to rise. From the colonial past to the democratic present, the Filipino journey is a testament to the power of endurance. It is the story of a people who have been conquered, divided, and tested, yet have never surrendered their soul. Epilogue. The unfinished journey, the history of the Philippines, is not a tale that ends in 1946, nor in any presidency. It is a living story, written every day by its people, at home and abroad, in triumph and in tears. From the shores of Mactan to the streets of EDSA, from the cry of revolution to the songs of freedom, one truth echoes through time. The Filipino spirit cannot be conquered. Empires have come and gone. Colonizers have ruled and fallen. Wars have destroyed and passed. But the soul of the nation endures humble, proud, and free. The Philippines today stands not as a perfect nation, but as a living nation, one still building, still dreaming, still defining what it means to be truly free. And as its flag waves beneath the same sun that once shone over revolution and ruin, it carries a promise that the struggle of the past was not in vain. Because every time the Filipino rises after a fall, rebuilds after a storm, and forgives after pain, the nation is reborn again, forever resilient, forever Filipino.